Bambi by Felix Salten. Translated by David Willey. Chapter 12. The meadow had long since lost its catkins. Everything began to turn green, although the young leaves on the bushes and the trees were still small. Shimmering in the tender light of early morning, they showed a smiling freshness, and seemed like little children when they had just woken up. Bambi stood in front of a hazel bush, striking his new crown against wood. That was so enjoyable, and it was also necessary, as the glory of his head was still wrapped in velvet and fur. They had to come off, that was a matter of course, and no one with any sense of tidiness would just wait for them to fall off by themselves. Bambi swept his crown so that the coating of velvet was torn to shreds, and long strips of it dangled around his ears. While he stuck up and down at the hazel bush, he felt that his crown was harder than it had been. This feeling permeated his whole being and gave him an inebriated sense of pride and strength. He pushed himself harder against the bush, and this coating was torn off in long pieces. The naked white wood could be seen, and in the unfamiliar open air it quickly turned a dusty red. Bambi was not able to care about that. He saw the pale flesh of the wood flash up under his movements, and that enchanted him. Here in this round place there were many other hazel bushes and dogwood bushes that showed the marks of his efforts. "Have you nearly finished, then?" said a cheerful voice from nearby. Bambi threw his head up and looked around. There sat the squirrel with a friendly look on his face. Bambi and the squirrel were nearly startled by the woodpecker, who, sitting close in to the trunk of the oak tree, called down, "Oh, please excuse me. I always have to laugh when I see the two of you like that." "What is it, then, that's making you laugh so loudly?" Bambi asked politely. "Well, then," thought the woodpecker, "you're doing the whole thing wrong. For one thing, you ought to have chosen a tree that's stronger. You won't get anything from a thin little hazel bush." "What should I be getting, then?" asked Bambi. "Beetles," the woodpecker laughed. "Beetles and grubs. Look, this is how you do it." He drummed on the trunk of the oak. Tuck, 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 tuck. The squirrel rushed up to him and quarrelsomely asked, "What do you think you're talking about? The prince isn't looking for beetles and grubs." "Why not?" asked the woodpecker complacently. "They taste delicious." He bit into a beetle, swallowed it, and went on drumming. "You don't understand," the squirrel scolded again. "A noble gentleman like this has other, higher goals to pursue. You just make yourself look ridiculous." "It doesn't matter to me," the woodpecker replied. "I don't care a thing about these higher goals of yours." He called cheerfully and flew away. The squirrel scampered back down. "Don't you know me?" he asked, looking very satisfied with himself. "I think I do know you," was Bambi's friendly answer. "You live up here," and he indicated the oak tree above them. The squirrel looked at him with a grin. "You're confusing me with my grandmother," he said. "I knew it. I knew you were confusing me with my grandmother. My grandmother used to live up there ever since she was a child, Prince Bambi. She often told me about you. Only then she was killed by the polecat, a long time ago. That was in the winter-time. Don't you remember?" "Yes, I do," Bambi nodded. "I heard about it." "Well, then, after that my father moved in here," the squirrel told him. He sat up, showed astonishment in his eyes, and held both his paws politely on his white breast. "But you might also be confusing me with my father. Did you know my father?" "I'm afraid not," Bambi answered. "I never did have that pleasure." "That's what I thought," exclaimed the squirrel in satisfaction. "My father was so surly and shy. He didn't have any contact with anyone." "Where is he now?" Bambi asked. "Oh," said the squirrel, "a month ago the owl got him. Yes, and now it's me who lives up here. I'm very satisfied with it. Just think, it was up here that I was born." Bambi began to turn and was about to go. "Wait," called the squirrel quickly. "I didn't mean to tell you all that stuff. I wanted to say something completely different." Bambi stayed where he was. "What was that, then?" he asked patiently. "Yeah, what was that?" The squirrel thought about it, then made another sudden leap, sat upright leaning against his magnificent bushy tail, and looked at Bambi. "Right, now I've got it," he continued to burble. "I wanted to tell you that you'll soon be ready with that crown of yours, and it's going to be very beautiful." "Do you think so?" asked Bambi, pleased. "Beautiful," declared the squirrel, and in his enthusiasm he pressed both his forepaws against his white breast. "So high, so majestic, and such long bright points. You don't often find them like that." "Really?" Bambi asked. He became so pleased that he went back to the hazel bush and started striking at it for a while longer. The velvet was thrown around into the air in long strands. Meanwhile, the squirrel went on speaking. I really must say that others of your age don't have a crown as magnificent as yours. You wouldn't think it's possible. Anyone who knew you last summer, and I did catch sight of you a few times in the distance, probably wouldn't believe you're the same deer. Such thin little sticks you had in those days." Bambi suddenly stopped. "Goodbye," he said hurriedly. "I have to go." And he ran off. He did not like being reminded of the previous summer. It had been a difficult time for him. First of all, after his mother had disappeared, he had felt totally abandoned. The winter had been so long, the spring came hesitantly, and it was a long time before anything green appeared. Without Mrs. Netla, Bambi would not have been able to manage, but she had taken him in and helped him in every way she could. Nonetheless, he often found himself alone. He missed Gobo all the time. Poor Gobo, who must now have been dead like the others. Gobo was continually on his mind all the time, and it was only too late that he realized how lovable he had been. He rarely saw Feline. She always stayed close to her mother, and turned out to be remarkably shy. Later, when, at last, it had become warm, Bambi began to recover his mood. He wiped his first crown clean of its velvet, and was very proud of it. But a bitter disappointment was soon to follow. The other crown-wearers chased him away whenever they saw him. They pushed him away angrily. They would not tolerate him going close to anyone, mishandled him until, with every step he took, he was afraid of being found by them, afraid of being seen anywhere, and he crept along the most hidden paths with a feeling of being oppressed. At the same time, while the days became warmer and sunnier, he became gripped by a strange unease. His heart became ever more oppressed with a yearning that was both painful and welcome. Whenever he happened to see Feline or one of her friends in the distance, he was overcome by a storm of excitement that he could not understand. It even happened quite often that he would recognize just a trace of where she had been, and that he would draw in breath to test the air and smell that she was nearby. He felt irresistibly drawn to her ever more often, but if he gave in to this longing that drew him to her, it always turned out badly. Either he would find no one in the end, tired after wandering about for so long, have to acknowledge that the others were avoiding him, or he came across one of the crowned heads, who would immediately leap out at him, hit him, push him, and drive him away, shouting insults. Worst of all, Rano and Karis had taken against him. No, that was not a happy time. And now the squirrel had stupidly reminded him of it. He suddenly became quite wild and began to run. The tits and the wrens flew out of the bushes in alarm as he went past them and asked each other urgently, "Who is that, then? Who is that, then?" Bambi did not hear them. A pair of magpies laughed nervously. "Has something happened?" The blue jay went cross and shouted, "What's going on?" Bambi paid him no attention. Above him the oriole flew by from tree to tree. "Good morning, I'm happy." Bambi made no answer. All around him the thicket was already light, and the rays of the sun ran through its fine beams. Bambi did not bother about that. There was a sudden loud rattling sound from near his feet. A whole rainbow of gorgeous colors flashed up and shone into his eyes so that he was dazzled, and he stopped. It was Janello, the pheasant, who had shot up into the air in startlement because Bambi had nearly stepped on him. He rushed away, scolding Bambi as he went. "Unheard of!" he shouted in his cracked, crow-like voice. Bambi was bewildered and watched him go. "Well, it's turned out all right, but you really were being very careless," said a soft, twittering voice from nearby on the ground. It was Janaline, the pheasant's wife. She sat brooding on the ground. "My husband was terribly alarmed," she continued, dissatisfied. "And so was I, but I can't move from the spot. I can't move from the spot whatever happens. You could very easily have trodden on me." Bambi was slightly ashamed. "Oh, I'm sorry," he stuttered. "I wasn't paying attention." Janaline answered, "Oh, please, maybe it wasn't quite that bad, but my husband and I were so nervous at present, you understand." Bambi understood nothing at all and went on his way. He had become much calmer now. All around him the wood was singing. The light became warmer and more golden, the leaves on the bushes, the grass on the ground, and steam rising from the damp earth took on a sharp aroma. Bambi's youthful strength swelled up in him and stretched out into all his limbs so that he became quite stiff. His movements became hesitant, as if he were something artificial. He went over to a small elder bush and, lifting his knees high into the air, he struck against the ground with powerful blows so that clods of the earth flew up from it. His fine, sharp cloven hoof cut the grass away that was growing here, wild peas and wild leeks, violets and snowdrops. He scraped them away till the earth lay before him, quite dashed and bare. With each blow, a dull thump could be heard. Bambi caught the attention of two moles who had been tumbling around at the roots of an old privet bush. They looked up and watched him. "But that's just ridiculous. What's he doing?" whispered one of them. "That's not how you dig." The other raised the corners of his mouth into a jeering grin. "He's got no idea, that's obvious. That's what you get when people do things they don't understand." Bambi suddenly stopped, lifted his head up high, listened, and looked around at the undergrowth. There was a flash of red between the twigs. It was unclear, but he could make out the points of a crown. Bambi snorted. Whoever it was creeping out there, Ronno or Karis or anyone else, go at him. I'll show him I'm not afraid of them anymore, he thought. It was as if he had suddenly been taken over by his own exhilaration. I'll show them that I'm the only one they should be afraid of. He ran into the bushes with such force that they rattled. The branches cracked and broke. Now Bambi could see the other deer in front of him. He was not able to recognize him because everything was swimming in front of his eyes. He could think of nothing but that he should go at him. With his crown lowered deep, he stormed forward, gathering all his strength into his neck, ready to strike. He could already smell his opponent's hairy coat, could already see nothing in front of him but the red wall of his flank. Then the other made a very gentle movement. Bambi had expected him to stay still, but he was robbed of this advantage when he rushed at him. His antlers met nothing but thin air. He nearly fell over, but he staggered, pulled himself up, and swung back round to renew his attack. Then he saw who the elder was. Bambi was so surprised he lost control of himself. He would have been ashamed to simply run from the spot, although that was what he most wanted to do. And he was ashamed to stay. He did not move. "What's this, then?" the elder asked quietly. His voice deep, at the same time so relaxed and so imperious, drove itself, as it always did, straight through the center of Bambi's heart. He remained silent. The elder asked again, "What's all this?" I thought," stammered Bambi, "thought it was Ronno, or—" He became silent and dared to look shyly at the elder, and as he looked he became even more bewildered. The aged one stood there, motionless and powerful. His head had by now turned perfectly white, and his dark, proud eyes shone from their depths. "Why not against me?" the aged one asked. But Bambi looked at him, filled with remarkable enthusiasm and shuddering with a mysterious thrill. He wanted to call out, "Because I love you," but instead he answered, "I don't know." The aged one looked at him. "I haven't seen you for a long time. You've grown big and strong." Bambi gave no answer. He trembled with joy. The elder continued. He wanted to test him and make an assessment of him. Then, surprisingly, he stepped very close to Bambi, causing Bambi much alarm. "Whatever you do, do it with nobility," the aged one said. He turned away, and in the next moment he was gone. Bambi remained in the same spot for a long time afterward. Chapter 13. It was summertime and burning hot. The yearning began to rise again in Bambi. The yearning that he had felt earlier, but this time it was much stronger than before. It boiled his blood and made him restless. He wandered far and wide. One day he came across Feline. He had not expected to find her at all, for his thoughts were at that time very confused from all the restless yearning that had possessed him, and he had not realized she was there. Now she was standing in front of him. For a while he was speechless and merely stared at her. Then, awestruck, he said, "Feline, you've become so beautiful." Feline retorted, "Can you still recognize me, then?" "Of course I can still recognize you," Bambi exclaimed. "We grew up together, didn't we?" Feline sighed. "It's been so long since we saw each other." And then she added, "People can become complete strangers to each other." But she said it in a teasing way, simple and elegant, like she had used to. They remained together where they were. "This path here," said Bambi after a long pause, "this is the path I used to go along with my mother when I was a child." "It leads to the meadow," said Feline. "It was on the meadow that I first saw you," said Bambi, almost gaily. "Do you remember?" "Yes," answered Feline. "Me and Gobo." She sighed gently. "Poor Gobo." Bambi repeated her, "Poor Gobo." Then they began to talk about those days, and frequently asked each other, "Do you remember?" It turned out, to their delight, that they both remembered everything. "Out there on the meadow," Bambi recalled, "we played tag. Remember?" "I think we did," said Feline, and then she jumped away in a flash. At first Bambi just stood there, wondering what had happened, but then he rushed after her. "Wait, wait for me!" he shouted gaily. "No, I'm not going to wait," Feline teased him. "I'm in a tremendous hurry." And in short leaps she curved her way across the bushes and grass. Finally, Bambi caught up with her, blocked her way, and then they stood quietly together. They laughed and were very contented. Feline suddenly jumped into the air as if something had stung her, and leapt away again. Bambi rushed after her. Feline made a curve, and then another, threw herself from side to side and got away from Bambi time after time. "Stay where you are," he gasped. "Just stay where you are. I've got to ask you something." Feline stood still. She was curious and asked, "What do you need to ask me?" Bambi said nothing. "Oh, well, if you're just cheating," said Feline, and was about to run off. "No!" Bambi quickly exclaimed. "Stay there. I want to ask you, do you love me, Feline?" She looked at him with even more curiosity than before, and felt slightly wary. "I don't know." "Yes, you do," Bambi insisted. "You must know, and I know it too. I can feel it perfectly well that I love you. I've got a furious love for you, Feline. So now tell me, do you love me?" "Maybe it could be well that I'm fond of you," she answered casually. "And will you stay with me?" inquired Bambi, becoming more excited. "If you ask me nicely," Feline said gaily. Bambi lost control of himself and exclaimed, "I am asking you, Feline, my love, my beautiful Feline, do you hear me? I'm asking you with all my heart." "Then I certainly will stay with you," said Feline softly. And then she was gone. Enchanted, Bambi shot off again in pursuit of her. Feline swept across the meadow, turned sharply, and disappeared into a thicket. But when Bambi also turned suddenly in order to follow her, there was a stormy rustling in the bushes, and out sprang Karis. "Stop!" he called. Bambi did not understand. He was too occupied with Feline. "Let me pass," he said hurriedly. "I haven't got the time for you." "Go away from here," Karis ordered him crossly. "Go away now. If not, I will hunt you down till there's not an ounce of breath left in you. I forbid you to chase after Feline." Slowly, Bambi began to remember the previous summer, when he was so often humiliated by being chased away. He suddenly became angry. He said not a word, but immediately lowered his crown and threw himself at Karis. He hit him with such force that no one could have resisted it, and Karis was lying in the grass before he knew what had happened to him. He got up again as fast as lightning, but he was barely back on his feet when he was struck by another blow that left him reeling. "Bambi!" he shouted when he was about to shout a second time. "Bam!" And then a third blow slid down from his shoulder and caused so much pain it took his breath away. Karis jumped to one side to avoid receiving yet another blow from Bambi. He suddenly felt remarkably weak, and realized, to his disgust, that it was now a matter of life or death. A cold fear took hold of him. He turned to flee from Bambi, who was rushing close behind, and realized from Bambi's silence that in every sense, his anger and his ruthlessness, he was determined to kill him. Karis fell into a panic. He turned away from the path, used the last of his strength to break through into the bushes. There was nothing he could wish for, nothing he could think of, other than to yearn for mercy or for rescue. Bambi suddenly stopped and left him alone. Karis was so terrified that he did not notice this, and ran on through the bushes as well as he could. But Bambi had stopped because he had heard the fine call of Feline. He listened. There she called again, in fear, oppressed. He immediately turned around and hurried back. Once he was back on the meadow, he saw her just as she was fleeing into the thicket, pursued by Ronno. "Ronno!" called Bambi. He was not aware that he had called out. Ronno was not able to run very fast because his limp held him back, and he stopped. "Well, look who it is," he said in a genteel tone. "It's little Bambi. Can I help you in any way?" "I want," said Bambi, calmly, but in a voice that was distorted by the anger he was suppressing and the power he held back. "I want you to leave Feline alone, and I want you to go away immediately." "Oh, is that all?" said Ronno with contempt. "What a cheeky young lad you've turned into. I never would have expected that from you." "Ronno," said Bambi even more gently, "it's for your sake that I want it, because if you don't go away now, you will wish you could run away on those legs of yours, but you won't be able to run away any more." "What?" Ronno called out crossly. "Because I've got a limp, is it? Is that why you talk to me like that? You can hardly notice it anyway. Or perhaps, after seeing what a pitiful coward Karis was, you think I'm frightened of you. Let me tell you this." "No, Ronno," Bambi interrupted him. "Let me tell you something. Go away." His voice quivered as he spoke. "I've always liked you, Ronno. I've always thought you're very clever, and I've felt respect for you because you're much older than me. But now I'm telling you, for the last time, go away. I haven't got any more patience left." "Pity you've got such little patience," said Ronno with contempt. "A great pity for you, lad. But now just calm down. I'll soon be finished with you. You won't have to wait long. Or maybe you've forgotten how many times I've pushed you along." Bambi had no words to put against this reminder, and was no longer able to control himself. He rushed at Ronno like a madman, and Ronno received him with his head lowered. They crashed together. Ronno stood his ground and wondered why Bambi did not back away. He was also astonished at this sudden attack. He had not expected Bambi to attack at all. He felt uncomfortable at Bambi's enormous strength, and realized he would need to pull himself together. They stood there, pressed brow to brow, and Ronno decided he would use a trick. He backed away suddenly so that Bambi lost his balance and tumbled over. But Bambi raised himself on his hind legs and threw himself at Ronno with twice as much fury. Before Ronno had even found the time to stand firm, there was a sharp crack as one of the branches of Ronno's crown broke. He thought his entire forehead had been smashed. He saw stars in front of his eyes and saw a swishing in his ears. In the next moment, a powerful blow tore open his shoulder. He had no breath. He lay on the floor, and Bambi stood angrily over him. "Leave me alone," Ronno groaned. Bambi continued to strike him anywhere he could. There was a gleam in his eyes. He seemed to have no thought of showing any mercy. "Please, just stop," Ronno begged him pitifully. "You do know I walk with a limp. I was only making a joke. Spare me. Don't you understand a joke?" Bambi, without a word, stopped his attack. With great effort, Ronno stood up. He was bleeding, and he staggered. Without a word, he limped away. Bambi was about to go into the thicket to find Feline, but then she came out of it. She had been standing close to the edge of the trees and seen everything. "That was wonderful," she said with a laugh, but then she became serious and gently added, "I love you." The two of them went on their way together, and they were very happy. Chapter 14. One day they were deep in the woods looking for the little clearing where Bambi had last come across the elder. Bambi told Feline about him with great enthusiasm. "Maybe we'll find him again. I really want to find him again." "That would be nice," said Feline perkily. "I'd really like to talk with him sometime." But she was not telling the truth. She may well have been curious, but in fact she was afraid of the elder. The sky was already light gray. The sun was about to rise. They ambled along next to each other, into the place where the bushes and the wild cabbages stood isolated from other vegetation, so that there was a clear view in all directions. They heard a rustling not far away. They immediately stopped and looked in that direction. The stag strode slowly and powerfully through the bushes and into the clearing. In the twilight it was not possible to see any colors, and he appeared as an enormous gray shadow. Feline immediately screamed. Bambi took hold of himself. He was, of course, just as startled as Feline, and her scream only made it worse. But her voice had sounded so helpless that he felt pity for her and forced himself to reassure her. "What's the matter, then?" he whispered anxiously, but there was a tremble in his voice. "What's the matter? He won't do us any harm." Feline simply continued screaming. "Don't get so upset, my love. It's not nice." Bambi urged her. "It's ridiculous to always be afraid of these gentlemen. They are relatives of ours, after all." But Feline did not want to hear anything about their being relatives. She stood there, very stiff, stared at the stag as he went unbothered on his way, and she screamed and screamed. "Pull yourself together," scolded Bambi. "What's he going to think of us?" There was nothing that could have calmed Feline down. "He can think what he wants," she shouted, and went on screaming, "Oh, but oh! Nobody should ever be as big as that." She continued to scream, "But oh!" and went on to say, "Leave me alone, I can't help it, I have to. But oh, but oh, but oh!" The stag was now standing in the little clearing and looking languidly in the grass for something tasty to eat. As he looked alternately at Feline as she panicked, and at the calm and relaxed stag, something rose up in Bambi. The words of comfort he had offered to Feline had also helped him overcome his own alarm at the sight of the stag. Now he scolded himself for falling into a pitiful state every time he saw the stag, a state where horror, excitement, admiration, and inferiority were all mixed together and made him suffer. "That's all nonsense," he decided with much effort. "Now I'm going to go right up to him and introduce myself." "Don't do that," shouted Feline. "Don't do that, but oh! Something terrible will happen, but oh!" "I'm going to do it whatever happens," Bambi retorted. The stag, so relaxed as he picked out all the best things to eat, paid no attention at all to Feline as she screamed. It seemed to Bambi that he was far too haughty. He felt injured and humiliated. "I'm going out there," he said. "Just calm down. Nothing's going to happen, you'll see. You wait here." He actually did go out there. But Feline did not wait. She did not want to wait, not in the slightest, nor did she have the courage to do so. She swung round and ran away, and could still be heard as she got further and further away. "But oh! But oh!" Bambi would have liked to go after her, but that was no longer really possible. He pulled himself together and went forward. Through the twigs and branches he could see the stag standing in the clearing, his head lowered to the ground. But Bambi felt his heart thumping as he went out there. The stag immediately raised his head high and looked over him. Then, as if confused, he looked straight ahead. Bambi saw both these movements as very haughty. The way the stag had looked at him, and the way he was now occupied with looking straight ahead as if there were nobody there, Bambi did not know what he should do. He had come out here with the firm intention of speaking to the stag. "Good morning," he would have said. "My name is Bambi. May I ask what your name is, sir?" Certainly. He had imagined this flowing very smoothly, and now it turned out not to be as simple as he had thought. What was the use here of having the best intentions? Bambi did not want to seem to be badly brought up, but that is how it would seem if he came here without saying a word. Nor did he want to impose himself on the stag, but that was what he would be doing if he started talking. The stag stood there in indignant majesty. Bambi was alarmed and felt humiliated. He tried in vain to shake himself into doing something, and just one thought kept running through his head. Why should I let him frighten me? I'm just as good as he is. Just as good as he is. It did not help. Bambi continued to feel frightened, and felt deep in the heart of him that he was just not as good as he is, not by a long way. He felt pitiful, and he needed all his strength to keep any kind of dignity. The stag looked at him and thought, "He is charming, truly delightful, so good-looking, so elegant, so fine in all his movements. But I'd better not stare at him like this. That would really not be proper, and I might even embarrass him." And he looked away from Bambi and went on gazing into the distance. That haughty look, Bambi decided. It's unbearable, the way he puffs himself up. The stag thought, I'd like to talk with him. He seems so likable. It's so stupid the way people never talk to each other. And he continued to occupy himself with gazing thoughtfully into the distance. "I'm just like the air for him," said Bambi. "People like that always act as if they were the only people in the world." But what should I say to him? The stag wondered. I've never had any practice in this. I'd say something ridiculous and make myself a fool, as I'm sure he's very clever. Bambi pulled himself together and looked hard at the stag. He's so majestic, he thought, still unsure of himself. Well, perhaps another time, the stag finally concluded, and he walked away, unsatisfied but majestic. Bambi, embittered, stayed where he was. Chapter 15. The forest was steaming under the burning sun. Ever since it had risen, it had been drinking all the clouds out of the sky, even the tiniest wisps, and now it reigned alone in the expanse of blue, made pale by the heat. Over the meadows and the tree-tops, the air shimmered in glassy, transparent waves, like it does above a flame. Not a leaf moved, not a blade of grass. The birds remained silent. They sat hidden in the shade of the leaves and did not move from the spot. All the paths and lanes through the clearings were empty, as no animal was moving anywhere. The forest lay motionless in the dazzling light, as if in flame. The earth breathed. The trees, the bushes, and the animals breathed in the weighty luxury of this heat. Bambi slept. He had spent a happy night and into the light morning romping with Feline. It was such bliss that he even forgot to eat. But that was because he had tired himself out so much that he did not even feel any hunger. His eyes fell shut. He had just gone into the middle of the undergrowth where he stopped, laid himself down, and fell straight to sleep. The junipers, inflamed by the sun, threw out a bitter sharp smell. The fine aroma from the young dampness rose into his head and exhilarated him as he slept and gave him new strength. Suddenly, he woke up and felt confused. Was that not Feline calling out? Bambi looked around. In his own memory he could still see her as she stood here close by the hawthorns and picking off the leaves while he lay down. He had thought she would stay there beside him, but now she was gone. She had probably become tired of being alone, and was now calling for him to come and find her. As Bambi listened, he wondered how long he could have been asleep, and how many times Feline could have called. He could not work it out. His head was still dull behind the veil of sleep. Then the call came again. Bambi swung round suddenly to face the direction the sound came from. There it was again, and he was suddenly cheerful. He felt wonderfully refreshed, felt he had rested long enough, felt strengthened, and he felt immensely hungry. He heard the call again, loud and clear, as fine as gentle songbird. Yearning and tender, "Come, come." Yes, that was her voice, that was Feline. Bambi rushed from where he was with such urgency that the thin twigs on the bushes broke, and their hot green leaves merely rustled. But while he was jumping, he had to stop and throw himself to one side. There stood the elder, blocking his way. The only thing seething in Bambi was his love. He did not care about the elder any more. He would certainly come across him again some time. But now he had no time for the old gentleman, however venerable they might be. All he could think of now was Feline. He made a perfunctory greeting and wanted to get quickly past him. "Where are you going?" the elder asked seriously. Bambi was slightly ashamed, wondering how he could talk his way out of it. Then he regained his senses and said honestly, "To her." "Don't go," said the elder. For a second, a spark of anger rose up in Bambi, just one. Not go to Feline? How could the elder expect that of him? "I'll just run away," thought Bambi, and he quickly looked at the elder, but the depth of the gaze directed at him from the elder's dark eyes held him where he was. He shook with impatience, but he did not run away. "She's calling for me," he said, by way of explanation. He said it in a way that was clearly pleading. "Don't get in my way." "No," said the elder, "she is not calling for you." The sound came again, loud and clear like a bird song. "Come!" "Again now," shouted Bambi as he became more cross. "Listen to me." "I'm listening," the elder nodded. "Goodbye, then," Bambi threw at him curtly. But the elder commanded him, "Stay here." "What is it you want, then?" shouted Bambi, out of control. "Let me go. I haven't got time for this. Please, if Feline is calling for me, you must be able to see." "I'm telling you," said the elder, "that is not Feline." Bambi was puzzled. "But I recognize her voice. I can hear it quite clearly." "Listen to me," the elder continued. The call came again. The ground was burning under Bambi's feet. "Later I'll come back," he implored. "No," said the elder sadly. "You would not come back. Not ever." The call came yet again. I've got to." Bambi was beginning entirely to lose control of himself. "All right, then," the elder explained, still in command. "But the two of us will go there together." "Quickly," Bambi declared and ran ahead. "No, go slowly," the elder now commanded in a voice that left Bambi with no choice but to obey. "You stay behind me, step by step." The elder began to move forward. Bambi followed behind him, impatient and sighing. "Listen," said the elder without stopping. "However many times you hear that call, do not move from my side. If it is Feline, then we'll find her soon enough. But it's not Feline. Don't let it tear you away from me. It all depends on whether you trust me or not." Bambi did not dare to contradict him, and remained silent. The elder walked slowly forward. Bambi followed. Oh, how skilled the elder was in knowing how to walk. No sound came from under his hoofs. Not a leaf moved, not a twig cracked. In this way the elder crept through the dense undergrowth, slid his way through the tangle of ancient bushes. Bambi could only be amazed. He had to admire the elder despite his feverish impatience. He had never realized it was possible to go forward in this way. The call came again and again. The elder stopped, listened, and nodded his head. Bambi stood near him, shaken with yearning, tortured by what he had to do, and understood nothing. The elder stopped several times without the call having been heard. He would throw his head up high, listen, and nod. Bambi heard nothing. The elder turned away from the direction that the call was coming from. He was going to approach it in a curve. This made Bambi very angry. The call came over and again. At last they were getting nearer, nearer still, then very near. The elder whispered, "Whatever you see now, don't move. Do you hear? Pay attention to everything I do, and you do exactly the same. Be careful, and don't panic." A few steps further on, there suddenly became a sharp, stimulating smell that Bambi knew so well, strong in his nose. It was so strong that he nearly cried out. He stood there as if nailed to the ground. His heart suddenly began to beat so hard, he could feel it in his throat. The elder stood relaxed next to him. He showed the direction with his eyes, there, and there stood he. He stood quite close, nearby, pressed against the trunk of an oak tree, covered in hazel bushes, and the gentle call could be heard, "Come, come." All that could be seen was his back. His face was very unclear, and he could only be seen at all when he turned his head slightly to one side. Bambi was so completely confused, so shocked, that he only slowly came to understand. He was standing there. It was him who had been imitating Feline's voice. It was him who had been whistling, "Come, come." A pale horror ran through Bambi's limbs. The thought of flight came up from his heart and pulled at him, tugged at him. "Keep still," the elder promptly commanded in a whisper, as if he wanted to preempt an outbreak of panic. And Bambi, with some effort, kept control of himself. The elder looked at him. It seemed to Bambi at first, despite where he was, that the elder was gently mocking him. But then, straight afterwards, he seemed once more to be fully serious and benevolent. Bambi blinked as he looked over to where he stood, and felt that he would no longer be able to stand being near something as horrifying as this. The elder seemed to understand what Bambi was thinking. and whispered, "Let's go," as he turned round and left. They crept carefully away, the elder moving in strange zigzags, though Bambi could not understand why. Even now he felt it hard to contain his impatience as he followed these slow steps. It had been his yearning for Feline that had driven him along the path to this place, but now the urge to flee was chasing through his veins. The elder, though, continued in his slow walk, then stopped, listened, went on, still in a zigzag route, stopped again, went on again, very, very slowly. They must, by now, have been well away from that place of terror. He keeps on stopping, so I suppose it'll be all right if I start speaking again, and then I'll say thank you to him. He could see the elder just in front of him as he disappeared into a dense tangle of dogwood brushes. Not a leaf moved, not a twig cracked as the elder crept into it. Bambi followed him and tried very hard to pass through just as silently, just as artfully to avoid making any sound, but he did not have that luck. The leaves rustled gently, the branches bent under the pressure of his flank, flicked back against the loud rattling, dry twigs with a quick, loud crack against his breast. He saved my life, Bambi continued to ponder. What should I say to him? But the elder could no longer be seen. Bambi stepped very slowly out of the bushes, saw a wild tangle of golden rods in front of him, raised his head and looked around. There was not a blade of grass moving for as far as he could see. He was alone. There was nothing now to tell him what to do. The urge to flee quickly took hold of him. As he rushed through them, the golden rods were divided with a broad hiss, as if being cut down by a scythe. It was a long time wandering, lost in the forest, before he found Feline. He was breathless, he was tired, he was happy, and deeply moved. "Please, my love," he said, "please, don't call to me when we are apart. Never call to me again. We can look for each other until we find one another, but please don't call to me as... Your voice is something I can't resist." Chapter 16. A couple of days later, with nothing to worry about, they made their way through the thicket of oaks that lay on the other side of the meadow. They were about to go across the meadow, and there, where the lofty oak tree stood, they would be back on their usual paths. The bushes ahead of them became lighter, and there they stopped and peered out. There, by the oak tree, there was something in red moving. "Who could that be?" whispered Bambi. "I expect it's Rano or Karis," thought Feline. Bambi doubted this. "They don't dare to come near me any more." Bambi looked more carefully. "No," he decided. "That isn't Karis or Rano. That's a stranger." Feline agreed, astonished and very curious. "You're right, stranger. I can see that too now. Odd." They watched. "He seems very careless," called Feline. "Stupid," said Bambi. "He is really stupid. He's behaving like a little child, as if there weren't any danger at all." "Let's go over there," suggested Feline. She was too curious. "All right, then," Bambi answered. "Let's go. I want to get a closer look at this lad." They made a few steps, but then Feline hesitated. "But what if he wants to fight you? He's strong." "Bah!" Bambi lowered his head to one side and had a disdainful look. "Just look how small his crown is. Why should I be frightened of that? He's big and fat, but strong? I don't think so. Just come with me." Across the meadow, the other deer was busy biting at grass, and did not notice them until they had come quite a long way out onto the meadow. He immediately ran out to meet them. He made joyful, playful jumps, and again seemed to be very childlike. Bambi and Feline were puzzled and waited for him. Now he was just a few steps away. Like them, he stood still. After a while, he asked, "Don't you recognize me?" Bambi had lowered his head, ready for combat. "Do you know us?" he replied. The stranger interrupted him. "But Bambi!" he called, full of admonishment, but trusting. Bambi became very hesitant when he heard his name being used. The sound of this voice tugged at some kind of memory in his heart. But Feline made no delay and jumped forward to meet the stranger. "Gobo!" she exclaimed, and then she was silent. She stood there without a word, without moving. She had lost her breath completely. "Feline," said Gobo gently. "Feline, sister, you recognize me." He went to her and kissed her on the mouth. Suddenly the tears began to flow down his cheeks. Feline cried too, and she was unable to speak. "But Gobo," Bambi began. His voice quivered, and he was very excited. He was deeply touched and astonished beyond measure. "Gobo, aren't you dead?" Gobo laughed. "You can see, can't you? I think it's easy enough to see that I'm not dead." "But that time in the snow," Bambi persisted. "That time?" Gobo lowered his head bashfully. "That time it was him who saved me." "And where have you been all this time?" asked Feline now in astonishment. Gobo answered, "With him." I've been with him all this time." He became silent, looked at Feline and Bambi, and greatly enjoyed the sight of their helpless astonishment. Then he added, "Yes, my dear friends, I've had many new experiences, more than all of you put together here in the forest of yours." It sounded a little boastful, but they did not notice that. They were too taken up with the enormity of their surprise. "Tell us about them," exclaimed Feline, unable to control herself. "Well," said Gobbo complacently, "I could tell you about them all day long, and wouldn't have told you everything." Bambi insisted. "Go on, then. Tell us." Gobbo went over to Feline and became serious. "Is Mother still alive?" he asked timidly and quietly. "Yes," Feline cheerfully declared. "She's alive. I haven't seen her for a long time, though." "I want to go and see her straight away," said Gobbo. "Are you coming with me?" And off they went. All along the way they were silent. Bambi and Feline could feel Gobbo's impatience yearning to see his mother, and that's why neither of them said anything. Gobbo strode hurriedly forward and said nothing. They did nothing to stop him, except that now and then, when he blindly ran through a place where the paths crossed, always running straight ahead, and when in sudden haste he rushed into another direction, they would now quietly call to him. "This way," Bambi would whisper, or Feline would say, "No, it goes around here now." A couple times they had to go across broad clearings. They noticed Gobbo never stopped at the edge of the trees, never even glanced around to see that it was safe before he went out into the open. He would simply run out there with no caution at all. Bambi and Feline looked at each other in amazement whenever it happened, but they said nothing and hesitantly followed Gobbo. They had to wander about in this way, searching and going up and down, for a long time. Gobbo suddenly recognized the paths he had used in his childhood. He looked at them in wonder, and it did not occur to him that Bambi and Feline had led him to them. He looked around at them and declared, "What do you think of that? Look how good I was at finding my way here." They said nothing. They merely, once more, looked at each other. Shortly afterwards they came to a small chamber in the foliage. "Here," called Feline as she slipped into it. Gobbo followed her and then stopped. It was the chamber where they both had been born, where they had lived as little children with their mother. Gobbo and Feline looked close into each other's eyes. They said not a word. Feline kissed her brother gently on the lips. They hurried on. They probably spent another hour going up and down. The sun shone more and more brightly through the twigs. The forest became more and more quiet. It was time to lie down and rest. Gobbo, though, did not feel tired. He hurried forward, breathed heavily because of his impatient excitement, and looked around without any plan. He flinched when a weasel rushed out from the long grass and passed under him. He nearly stepped on the pheasants, who were pressed close to the ground. And when they flew up in front of him with very loud flapping of wing and told him off as he was very alarmed, Bambi was amazed at how unfamiliar he seemed with everything, and how he proceeded as if blind. Gobbo stopped and turned to the two of them. "We can't find her," he exclaimed in bewilderment. Feline soothed him. "We will do so soon," she said with emotion. "Not long now, Gobbo." She looked at him. He was once again wearing that disheartened expression that she knew so well. "Should we call for her?" she said with a grin. "Should we start calling again, like we used to, when we were still children?" Bambi continued walking, just a few steps, and then he caught a glimpse of Auntie Ina. She had already lain down to rest, and lay without moving in the shadow of a hazel bush, very near. "At last," he said to himself. At that moment Gobbo and Feline arrived. All three of them stood beside each other and looked over at Ina. She had quietly raised her head and looked sleepily at them. Gobbo made a few hesitant steps forward and gently called, "Mother!" As if snatched up by a thunderbolt, Ina was no longer lying down, but on her feet, standing as if cemented into position. Gobbo quickly jumped to her. "Mother," he began again. He wanted to speak, but he could not utter a word. His mother looked very closely into his eyes. He began to stand with less stiffness. She was shaking so much that wave after wave ran over her back and shoulders. She asked no questions. She did not ask for an explanation, not for any account of what had happened. Slowly she kissed Gobbo on the lips, kissed his cheeks, his neck, without cease. She washed him with her kisses, just as she had done when she had given birth to him. Bambi and Feline had left. Chapter 17. They stood together in the middle of a thicket in a small clearing, and Gobbo told them where he had been. Their friend, the hare, sat there too, raised his ears in amazement as he listened intensely, and let them sink again in awe at what he heard, only to raise them again immediately after. The magpie squatted on the lowest twig of a young beech tree and listened in astonishment. The jay sat uneasily near by an ash tree, sometimes screeching in his amazement. A pair of pheasants, they knew, had found their way there with their wives and children. They craned their necks in wonderment as they listened, drew them back in, turned their heads here and there, and remained speechless. The squirrel bounded in and moved in a way that showed he was very excited. He soon slipped down on the ground, ran up one or other tree, then leaned back on his erected tail and showed his white breast. He continually wanted to interrupt Gobbo, wanted to say something, but each time all those around him ordered him to be quiet. He told them about how he had lain helpless in the snow and waited for death. "It was the dogs who found me," he said. "The dogs are terrifying. They're absolutely the most terrifying things in the whole wide world. Their throats are full of blood, their voices are full of anger and without mercy." He looked round at everyone there and went on. "But well, afterwards I played with them as though they were all equal." He was very proud of himself. "I don't need to be scared of them any more, because now we're all good friends. Still, though, when they start to get angry there's a thumping in my head, and my heart gets quite stiff. But they don't always mean it in such a nasty way. As I've just said, I'm their friend now, but there's so much power in their voices it's horrible." He became silent. "Go on, then," Feline insisted. Gobbo looked at her. "Well, back then they would have torn me limb from limb, but then he came along." Gobbo paused. The others could scarcely breathe. "Yes," said Gobbo, "then he came along. He called the dogs off, and they immediately became quite quiet. He called to them again, and they lay motionless on the ground in front of him. Then he lifted me up. I screamed, but he stroked me. He held me gently pressed onto his chest. He didn't hurt me, and then he carried me off." Feline interrupted him. "What do you mean, carried you?" Gobbo began to explain in detail, with some self-importance. "It's very easy," interjected Bambi. "Think of the squirrel, Feline. What does he do when he's holding a nut and carries it away?" Now the squirrel wanted a chance to speak at last. "A cousin of mine," he began with enthusiasm. But the others immediately insisted. Be quiet. Let Gobbo carry on speaking." The squirrel had to say something. He was cowed and bewildered, pressed his forepaws against his white chest, and turned to the magpie to speak just to him. "I was saying a cousin of mine." But the magpie simply turned his back on him. Gobbo told them of marvelous things. "It's cold outside, and the storm is howling, but indoors with him there's no wind, and it's always as warm as summer." "Ha!" screeched the jay. "Outside, the rain is lashing down from the sky so that everything is in water. But indoors, with him, there's not a drop of rain and you stay dry." The pheasants twitched their necks up high and turned their heads. "When everywhere outside was deep in snow, I was inside and nice and warm. I was even quite hot, and he gave me hay to eat, chestnuts, potatoes, turnips, everything I could have wished for." "Hay?" they all said in one voice, astonished, incredulous, excited. "Fresh sweet hay," Gobbo repeated calmly, and looked triumphantly round at them. The squirrel tried to squeeze in his voice. "A cousin of mine." "Just be quiet," the others ordered. And Feline asked Gobbo vigorously, "Where did he get hay from, and all those other things, in the winter?" "He grows it," answered Gobbo. "Whatever he wants, he grows it, and when he wants it, it's there for him." Feline continued asking questions. "Weren't you afraid, Gobbo, all the time you were with him?" Gobbo thought himself very clever and grinned. "My dear Feline, I wasn't afraid, not any more. After all, I knew he didn't want to do anything to hurt me. Why should I have been afraid? You all think he's very nasty, but he's not nasty. When he likes anyone, when anyone does something for him, he's nice, lovely and nice. But there's no one in the whole wide world who could be as nice as he is." Suddenly, as Gobbo was speaking in his way, an elder emerged silently from the bushes. Gobbo did not notice him and continued speaking, but all the others had seen the elder and held their breath in awe of him. The elder stood there without moving and watched Gobbo with deep and serious eyes. Gobbo said, "And it wasn't just him. It was his children. They loved me too, and his wife and everyone. They stroked me, gave me food, and played with me." He broke off. He had just seen the elder. Everyone became silent. Then the elder, in his calm and authoritative voice, asked, "What's that stripe on your neck?" Everyone looked at him, and he became aware, for the first time, of the dark stripe made up of compressed and eroded hair that went round Gobbo's neck. Gobbo answered the elder uncertainly, That's from a collar I wore. It's his collar, and yes, and it's great honor to wear his collar. It's—" He became confused and stammered. All were silent. The elder kept a sad and piercing look on Gobbo for a long time. "You poor thing," he said gently. Then he turned round and was gone. In the silence that followed from this disturbance, the squirrel started to chatter. You see, a cousin of mine was there with him too. He'd caught him and locked him in, oh, for a very long time, till one day my cousin—" But no one was listening to the squirrel. They all went away. Chapter 18. One day Marina turned up again. She was already nearly grown up when Gobbo disappeared, but she was almost never to be seen since then. She held herself apart and went on her own solitary ways. She had always had a slight build and looked quite young, but she was serious and quiet, and was more gentle than anyone else. Now she had heard from the squirrel, from jays and magpies, from thrush and pheasant, that Gobbo had come back home and had had wonderful experiences. There she appeared and wanted to see him. Gobbo's mother was very proud and happy about her visit. Most of all, Gobbo's mother was very proud of how happy she seemed. She was glad that the entire forest was talking about her son. She wallowed in his fame, and she wanted everyone to acknowledge that Gobbo was the cleverest, the most capable, and the best. "What do you think, Marina?" she called. "What do you think of Gobbo?" She did not want to wait for an answer, but just continued. "Can you still remember that time when Mrs. Netla said he wouldn't amount to much because he shivered a bit in the cold? Can you remember how she prophesied I'd never get much joy from him?" "Gobbo certainly gave you enough to worry about," Marina answered. "That's all in the past," Gobbo's mother declared, and was very surprised that anyone could still be thinking of these things. "Oh, I feel so sorry about poor Mrs. Netla. It's such a shame that she's no longer alive and can't see what my Gobbo has made of himself." "Yes, poor Mrs. Netla," said Marina gently. "It's a pity about her." Gobbo enjoyed hearing his mother praise him like this. It pleased him. He stood there and felt as if standing in warm sunshine when he heard these praises. His mother said to Marina, "Even the old prince came to see Gobbo." She said it in a way that was secretive, in a whisper and celebratory. "He's never let any of us catch a glimpse of him, but when it was Gobbo, he came." "Why did he call me a poor thing?" asked Gobbo, sounding very discontented. "I'd like to know what that was supposed to mean." "Don't you worry about that," his mother reassured him. "He's very old and a bit odd." But now, finally, said what was on his mind. "All this time I've been going round my head what he meant by that. You poor thing. I'm not poor. I'm not unlucky. I'm very lucky. I've seen more, I've had more experiences than anyone else. I know more about the world and about life than anyone here in the forest. What do you think, Marina?" "Yes," she said. "There's certainly no one who can gainsay that." From that day on, Marina and Gobbo were always together.